most people, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, particularly the Beatitudes section, is the most familiar of Jesus' speeches. Yet beginning students of the Gospels are often puzzled that this well-known and important speech appears only in the Gospel of Matthew. Mark and John omit it altogether. Luke records an alternative and much shorter form of the sermon, but on a plain rather than a mount. And Luke is often viewed to have the version closer to the older tradition, a source scholars refer to as Q, from the German word for source, Quelle. In Matthew's composition, there is a neat structure that flows from the 9 Beatitudes to the 6 antitheses to the 3 acts of mercy. The way persons should be in the world and in relationship to others, how persons should read and appropriate the tradition, and how persons should act are the basic emphases of Jesus' sermon. In addition, the Lord's Prayer and the Golden Rule, 2 foundational texts of the Christian church, are found there. The sermon is not, however, a comprehensive statement on Jesus' immediate mission. Rather, it tackles various sorts of topics in order to lay out examples of what it means to be part of God's kingdom through the direction of Jesus. For Matthew, Jesus is the new Moses, the primary instructor of the faithful. Thus, the sermon functions to establish guidelines on how to develop and maintain relationships in the new realm of God. The sermon is essentially a formational text for the community of Jesus' followers. There are fundamental, recurring themes or motifs in the sermon. The first one is Jesus' message of justice or righteousness. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Followers of Jesus must seek God's reign and its justice as a primary activity of discipleship. One specific example of doing justice is giving alms. After the Reformation, many biblical interpreters thought of the sermon as instruction for private life and practice only. Even the concept of righteousness was privatized for the individual. But a distinction between the private and the public was not so neatly delineated in Jesus' day. After all, the audience for Jesus' sermon included the crowds, if only from a distance, as well as the disciples. Jesus' teachings contained in the Beatitudes, the antitheses, and the acts of mercy all involve other persons, those inside and outside the community of faith. It may not mean that Jesus expected citizens of the Roman Empire to heed his teaching, but it certainly does mean that the details of his vision had expectations for the citizens of God's empire. To do unto others as you would have them do to you was not a principle to be applied only among Jesus' disciples, but rather to everyone. So in Matthew's account, Jesus begins the entire sermon with the so-called Beatitudes, succinct and memorable teachings that have played a crucial role in how we understand Jesus' message and mission. Those who, for example, are meek and pure in heart, and those who hunger and thirst for doing right, show mercy, and make peace, are all called blessed. To be blessed is not equivalent to our contemporary understanding of happiness, which can be artificial if defined only as good fortune, pleasure, or bliss, as some dictionaries do. Rather, it signifies divine favor upon those who contribute to a communal well-being by fostering a lifestyle of mission, caring for the welfare of others, doing justice, showing mercy, and walking humbly with our God. For Jesus, these are the ideal characteristics of any followers of God. And not surprisingly, Jesus points out it is a way of life associated with the prophets. Overall, the law has a positive function for Jesus and the Matthean community. What could that possibly mean after we hear over and over again, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you"? It basically means that an engaging interpretation and reinterpretation of the law is the truest example of how the tradition of Scripture remains a living source for contemporary followers of God. Most religious Jews understand this. This is true in Jesus' day, and it is true in ours. Keep in mind that Jesus' opening preface before he begins to engage the tradition is, "I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill." And whoever does the least of these commandments and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. When we look closely, we see that Jesus in some ways actually sharpens or tightens the law. This is true for his first three examples about murder, adultery, and divorce. For example, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire." In the second series of three examples, Jesus appears to challenge the allowances made in the law. This negotiation with the tradition is different than the first three examples. So, Jesus' basic strategy here is to think through the ramifications of what the tradition, that is the law, has said, and interpret accordingly. For Jesus, the law is a living tradition, and for Matthew, Jesus is the new lawgiver. What then is Jesus really after in his Sermon on the Mount? According to 548, the point of the whole sermon might well be summed up in a single sentence. "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Of course, this is just an ideal, right? No one can truly be perfect, can they? What could it actually mean to be perfect anyway? Notice the context of this saying in Jesus' sermon. Jesus asks his would-be followers to love enemies as an alternative way of thinking about relationships. This, of course, is a significant challenge to any person in any age. But Jesus goes on. He suggests that to love those we would normally hate classifies us as children of God. Here's how. "For God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous." So to be perfect in this context means to treat people fair, despite how they may have acted toward us. According to Jesus' teaching, we should not allow the actions of any person to determine how we treat them in return. Rather, we should treat all persons in the same way, with consistency and with kindness. This is the perfection of God. This is our example. This is the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. Well, we see in near the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says something that's actually quite profound and I think often misunderstood, that your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees. Oftentimes, our views, Christian contemporary views of the Pharisees are misguided, to put it nicely. And I just wonder how we can understand that concept in light of Jesus' understanding of the law, in light of what he's saying about righteousness, in light of how he views or at least Matthew portrays this view of the Pharisees, and the implications of that for the contemporary church.
Yeah, I don't think Jesus is the sort of guy who would say, "Don't worry, be happy, it's okay, whatever you do." So what he's doing, I think, in the Sermon on the Mount is saying, look, there are some other examples out there in society to whom you might look. The Pharisees are doing splendidly well, at least in terms of what they teach. They know what they're supposed to be doing, and in fact, perhaps in public, they might be doing it pretty well. Surely you can be better than them, and that means being really, really, really better, and really, really, really good.
So hearing Jesus affirming the position of the Pharisees throughout the Gospel of Matthew, I wonder if he would be as relaxed about keeping the law himself as many Christians seem to think.
Oh, I don't think he was relaxed. We see in what are called the antitheses, although they're really not, the intensifications of the law in the Sermon on the Mount. The law clearly says don't commit adultery. Jesus says don't even think about it. That's actually a rabbinic custom. It's called putting a fence about the law. I mean, just make sure you don't violate it by adding yet one more layer. Jesus is described as wearing fringes. That's what the hemorrhaging woman grabs onto when she's looking for a healing. And those fringes, which Orthodox Jewish men still wear, are commanded of Jews in the Book of Numbers. They're kind of like WWJD bracelets for Jews. They're there to remind you of the commandments. So of course he keeps the commandments. The thing in Judaism is the commandments don't come with instruction manuals. So you have a commandment that says honor the Sabbath, and then Jews for 3,000 years have been trying to figure out how you do this. But would Jesus have kept the law? Absolutely. And he would have expected his Jewish followers to do the same, and in fact, they did.
You mentioned the Sabbath, and that's one of the issues that keeps coming up in the Gospels. Jesus is seen as someone who breaks the Sabbath. Jesus touches a leper. Now, we read Leviticus and Numbers, we see all these regulations and think, does Jesus really care about purity issues? Does Jesus care about the purity of time, purity of bodies?
Oh, of course he does. There's no law that says you can't touch a leper any more than there's a law that says you can't touch a corpse. What touching a leper or touching a corpse does is it puts you in a state of ritual impurity. That means you can't go to the temple. Fine. That's not what most Jews are doing on a daily basis anyway. I think, in fact, most Jews are impure most of the time, and most don't care. What purity regulations do is they cause you to have a sense of the sanctity of the body. They cause you to have a recognition on a living, daily, palpable basis of knowing what goes into you, what comes out of you. When you come in contact with death or disease, you know it and you take it seriously. So the law in that case is not a stranglehold. Jesus honors the Sabbath and keeps it holy, and how does he do that? He heals people to enable them to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. In that sense, he's on par with some Jews, and some other Jews would have said, oh, if it's a chronic condition, it can wait till Monday. I think our physicians do the same things today, give it another day. That's a matter of interpretation of the law. But to wrestle over what the law means, that's very Jewish.
So there are no universal applicable laws about the Sabbath in Jesus' day that he is somehow unaware of.
No, the universal is you honor it and keep it holy.
Sure.
Then you go into the particulars, and at that point you have a lot of disagreement. In fact, you have a lot of disagreement today among contemporary Jews, let alone among contemporary Christians who are trying to figure out what one can and cannot do on the Christian Sabbath.
What do we do then with James in this discussion? I mean, it seems sometimes that our reading of Paul, a misreading of Paul and the law, sets up an antagonistic relationship with James. But in light of what you're saying, it seems that James and Paul might actually be saying something similar.
Yeah, well, the end result for James and Paul is you have justified Christians who have the appropriate belief system and the appropriate payoff of that belief system, which is good works. Paul's very clear, you're justified by faith apart from works of the law. But Paul, when he talks about justification, being put in a right relationship with God, means some sort of internal transformation that would naturally manifest itself in appropriate behavior. James, I think, is basically saying the same thing. You're justified by both your belief and your action. In other words, how do you know you're in a right relationship with God? Because your belief is in line and your behavior is also in line. James doesn't talk about, I think, circumcision and Jewish dietary regulations. He talks about the law of liberty. So I don't think he's enjoining upon any Gentiles in his audience those particular commandments that would have kept Jews distinct.
If we've misunderstood the Pharisees, we've misunderstood what it is to live under the covenant, we've also misunderstood Paul. We've made of him a preacher of faith only, and that is enough to be saved. How can we begin to hear Paul past several centuries of tradition that put all the emphasis on what we believe, what we think?
Yeah, I think the canonizers of the New Testament did a very nice job by putting Matthew first rather than Romans. Matthew is very clear. It's not those who say, Lord, Lord, it's those who do the will of the Father. I think one might also look at how contemporary Christians are sometimes perceived by folks on the outside. If the idea behind Christianity is only that one has an appropriate belief, which is in fact not something that you can control either. It's you either got it or you don't. And that makes you saved. that's not a very good image of the church that's being conveyed. I would very much like my children to understand Christians to be people who live a moral life, who care about social justice, who care about the environment, who care about the good gifts God has given us, and then serve as appropriate stewards for them.
So when we listen to Paul talking about being justified by faith and not by works, we have to be very careful to understand those works as a very particular, limited set of works that he wants to exclude from Gentile Christians. And here, most of the time, when we're thinking about Paul, that through the Spirit, we fulfill the just requirement of the law, which is a transformed life.
Right, and that's what we might want to call sanctification. So after you get yourself justified, you're in this right relationship, you live out a life of sanctification. And Paul's very clear, you don't do certain things, and you do certain things. So there has to be a behavioral aspect to entering into this Christian covenant.